When Amelia Earhart disappeared in 1937 during her attempt to fly around the world, she was already known as America's most famous female aviator. Her sense of daring and determination, rare for women of her time, brought her fame from the day she became the first woman to cross the Atlantic in an airplane. She was an uncommonly courageous woman who was lucky to meet a brilliant man who helped her dreams take wing.
My mother always told me that I should behave like a proper Victorian lady. But I never was. When I was 7 years old, I got a sled for Christmas. Now, instead of sitting up properly like my grandmother told me to, I went to the top of the highest hill in my town and on my stomach went straight down into the street underneath the belly of a horse that was pulling a carriage and landed on the other side of the street. Now that sort of set the pace for my entire life. You see, I always took good luck for granted. My name is Amelia Earhart, and I was born in 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. My mother was a housewife, and my father was a tax lawyer who worked for the railroad and also happened to be an alcoholic. You see, my father used to keep a little bottle in his desk drawer, and he would take a sip now and then throughout the day. Now, because of this, my father was fired from every job he ever had. Well, in order for my father to keep a job, we had to move from town to town across the entire country. And like my father, I used to get in a lot of trouble too. You see, I was always very restless and I was bored very easily. Once I was kicked out of a finishing school in Pennsylvania for dancing on the roof in my nightgown. And then we moved to Chicago, and I got in a lot of trouble there too. When I got to Hyde Park High School, I passed around a petition to try to get rid of the English teacher. And my yearbook said that I was the one who always sat in the corner, reading books and writing poetry, and that I always wore the color brown. I also kept a very unusual scrapbook in high school of women's achievements. If I would see something in a newspaper or a magazine about a policewoman or a woman doctor, I would cut it out and I would put it in my scrapbook. You see, I wanted to achieve something great too. Now, after high school, World War I was going on. So I decided to go up to Canada and become a nurse's aide and help the soldiers for a while. And I did this for a couple of years, and I really loved being a nurse's aide. I loved hearing all of the stories that the soldiers would tell me about the war, and especially the stories about flying planes. But after a while, I got bored with being a nurse's aide. So I decided that I was going to become a social worker. So I moved to Boston, and I worked in an orphanage for about 2 years as a social worker. But then after a while, I got bored with being a social worker. So I decided that I was going to become a doctor. So I enrolled in pre-medical school at Columbia University in New York City, and I stayed there for an entire 3 years. I was even able to dissect a cockroach once. After 3 years, I got bored with being a doctor. Now, at this time, my mother and father had broken up because of my father's drinking. And my mother and sister were living in Boston, and my father moved to Oakland, California. So I decided to move to Oakland to be with my father for a while. Now, during the week, I worked in the mail room of the telephone company. And on the weekends, I helped my father in his office. Well, one day, my father took me to an air show. Now, this was something new and exciting. No one had ever seen anything like this before. And for $5, a person could take a ride up in an airplane. And so I did. And when I got up there, I knew that I had to learn how to fly. You see, everything was so beautiful from up there. And so I started taking flying lessons. And I took them from the first female flight instructor in the United States. Her name was Nita Snook. And the two of us became best friends. And I made this my little weekend hobby, just flying all around the West Coast, having a wonderful time. And after a while, when I got very good at it, I knew that I had to have my own plane. And I wasn't afraid to work for what I wanted. As a matter of fact, by the time I was 30 years old, I had had 28 part-time jobs. So in order to buy my plane, I took on another part-time job, driving a gravel truck. Now, a proper Victorian lady does not drive a gravel truck. And so when my mother and sister heard that that's what I was doing to buy my plane, they told me that they would help me with the rest of the money if I would quit that job. And so I did. And when I finally got my plane, I painted it a bright canary yellow. Oh, and of course I had to cut my hair because it was an open cockpit, and my hair was very long, so it would fly out the sides of the plane. But I did this only 1 inch at a time so that my family would never notice. I had such a wonderful time just flying all around the West Coast, but after a while, I got bored with California, so I decided to move back to Boston. And when I got there, I wanted to put together a women's aviator group. And so I printed up some flyers, and I put some ads in the newspaper, and 99 women showed up. And so we called it the 99s. Now, you see, at this time, the most famous person in the entire world was a man named Charles Lindbergh. Now, Charles Lindbergh had become famous because he was the very first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris. Well, in